Good evening, church. The selection of songs I picked this evening have to do with consecration and devotion. So first song will be page 701. My Jesus, I love thee, I know thou art mine. For thee all the follies of sin I resign. My precious Redeemer, my Savior, art thou. If ever I love thee, my Jesus is thou. I love thee because thou hast heard of me, and purchased my pardon on Calvary's tree. I love thee for wearing the thorns on thy brow. If ever I love thee, my Jesus is thou. In mansions of glory and endless delight, I'll ever adore thee in heaven so bright. I'll sing with the glittering crown on my brow. If ever I love thee, my Jesus is now. 699. They tried my Lord and Master with no one to defend. Within the halls of fire, he stood without a friend. I'll be a friend to Jesus, my life for him, I'll stand. I'll be a friend to Jesus, until my years shall end. The world may turn against him. I love him to the end. And while on earth I'm living, my Lord shall have a friend. I'll be a friend to Jesus, my life for him, I'll stand. I'll be a friend to Jesus, until my years shall end. To all who need a Savior, my friend I recommend, because he brought salvation, is why I am his friend. I'll be a friend to Jesus. 679. Sing the first, second, and fourth verse. First, second, and fourth verse. It's so sweet to trust in Jesus, just to take him at his word, just to rest upon his promise, just to know thus saith the Lord. Jesus, Jesus, how I trust him, how I prove him more and more. Jesus, Jesus, precious Jesus, oh, for grace to trust him more. Oh, how sweet to trust in Jesus, just to trust his cleansing blood, just in simple faith to plunge me neath the healing cleansing flood. Jesus, Jesus, how I trust him, how I prove him more and more. Jesus, Jesus, precious Jesus, oh, for grace to trust him more. I'm so glad I learned to trust thee, precious Jesus, Savior, friend. And I know that thou art with me, will be with me to the end. Jesus, Jesus, how I trust him, how I prove him more and more. Jesus, Jesus, precious Jesus, oh, for grace to trust him more. Song after lesson will be page 683. You want him to hide next week? You want him to hide next week? Can I go in and hide next week? I don't think we'll be hiding turkeys. Good evening. I asked Mike if he's going to be going into hiding next week. People are going to be hunting for turkeys. I'm a better one myself. I am going into hiding. I didn't mention it this morning. Casey picked up sinus infection. I'm trying not to get it from her. So I keep telling her she's unclean, so stay away. I don't think it's going over real well. So there's an interesting chapter in Luke chapter 7. I kind of skipped over the last parables that are in Matthew because I kind of want to save them toward the end of the series of the parables because of what they deal with. And but there's an interesting chapter, and Jesus used the word parable in speaking to this Pharisee, but as he starts out, you have to go into the context, and it plays into the parable. And so in the beginning, so you have to kind of put it, so we're going to look at this chapter in three parts. And because it may, in verse 1 it says, happened as he went into the house of one of the rulers of the Pharisees to eat bread on the Sabbath, that they watched him closely. Evidently, when I saved the file from my flash drive, I made a misprint, a typo, and it said, oh, heresy. And so they were trying to figure out who that was, Kathy and Jennifer. And I said he was a Jew, Irish Pharisee. So, but you know, it's important to think about some things that we get tied up sometime. Notice that it was on the Sabbath, eat bread. And so notice this other point, that they watched him closely. You know, and that gets important when we think about things. You ever had somebody just waiting for you to mess up? That's what they were doing. They were looking and watching for him to mess up. So as he goes in and says, behold, there was a certain man before him who had dropsy. And Jesus answering spoke to the lawyers, Pharisees, saying, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Now, why would he ask that question? Because he's fixing to. Don, did you say something?
No, I didn't say that.
Oh, okay, I heard you.
No, don't work on the Sabbath.
Yeah. No work on the Sabbath. That's the big one. Work on that. Let us be honest, because we're going to go on this next text before we get into it. Let's think about this. Did God actually mean not to do absolutely anything on the Sabbath?
Some of the things in the priesthood had to be done.
Yeah, certain things in the priesthood had to be done every Sabbath. There were things that they respect, but you know, in the time they told them not to gather food, that point that it was not to be a working day. That's really what it came down to. God did not want to treat it as a day that they could work and generate. But notice this, but they kept silent. And he took him and healed him and let him go. Then he answered him, saying, which of you having a donkey or an ox that has fallen into a pit will not immediately pull him out on the seventh day? And they could not answer him regarding these things. Now, it's interesting because he asked him that, and here's the reality. If you're going to do well for an animal, why wouldn't you do well for a human? And what he did, was that really work? Performing this miracle? You ever tried to get an animal out of a pit? That's work. That's work in these times, and they didn't even have modern machinery. Okay? So there's a point there that he's making. Now, it's interesting because you go back one chapter. And here's another example. And there were many times that Jesus healed on the Sabbath. In fact, where we referenced the man being healed this morning, if I'm not mistaken, that was on the Sabbath. Now notice, he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath. And behold, there was a woman who had a spirit of infirmity 18 years and was bent over and could in no way raise herself up. But when Jesus saw her, he called her to him and said to her, woman, you are loose from your infirmity. And he laid his hands on her, and immediately she was made straight and glorified God. But the ruler of the synagogue answered with indignation because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath. And he said to the crowd, there are 6 days in which men ought to work. Therefore, come and be healed on them and not on the Sabbath day. He's chastising these sick people that come to get healed, and he's chastising Jesus for healing. Now, if he's the ruler of the synagogue, what should he know? Should he not know the law? What's the primary or secondary commandment of the law? Love your neighbor as yourself.
But he's working with the additional laws that the Pharisees.
There we go. He did. Yeah, he's addition with that commandments of men that was taking their heart far from God. God never intended the Sabbath to take away man's compassion.
Yeah, the Sabbath wasn't made for man.
No, it wasn't made for man. It was made for God. And that's the thing. But it was never intended to take away a person's compassion. And this is something that we have to think about today. Can we get in that same mode? I seen some preachers one time chewing on a guy. This was on a Facebook deal, member church, because he was a fireman. Why do you think they're chewing on a fireman? Because there were times he wasn't there on Sunday because he worked 3 days, 4 days off. So it rotated. He had about one Sunday a month he had off. But yet, as he tried to point out to them, he was the only member of the church in that firehouse. And if they didn't have a call, they had Bible study and a service there in the firehouse with him directing it. So how do we get so strained up into that we lose our compassion for trying to spread the gospel on the Lord's Day? That's not much different.
I wanted to rephrase, a man wasn't made for the Sabbath. Sabbath was made for man.
Yeah, Sabbath was made for the man. Man wasn't made for the Sabbath. Sabbath was made for the man. But it was a point of getting the man to realize that they needed to be striving to be close to God and not using it as an income. Ron?
And there has to be a balance there too, because if your job causes you to miss work every single day, then you probably need to change jobs.
Yeah, possibly, but but there has to be a balance. But we have to be careful where we put that balance on people. That person had to decide that, because sometimes it's not as clear cut as we think. There are a lot of years I couldn't go on Sunday night, that I could go on Sunday morning in a restaurant, and then there were years that I could come on Sunday night. Then there were some days, like speed weeks, when the 500 was, I was lucky to get out of the store by 9 o'clock at night after going in at 4. But there is that point. Now, I do remember this one particular time that when I was working mainly nights, and the general manager was on vacation, so I had to work the day shift, cover for him, and I had someone come in from church, what we called the church rush, to eat with his family, and started chewing on me for not being there that morning and being at work. Now, here's a point I want to tell you. If you get in that point that people should not be working, you better not be going out and spending money. Because as I told him, if it wasn't profitable for the business to be open, would it be open? So if people would quit going out and spending money. And incidentally, one of them that was chewing on this fireman, I had met him and his family one day, and we went to the mall on my way home from Georgia to Florida a Sunday afternoon. So I reminded them of that. You got to have that standard. I agree with Ron. We need to be looking for the way that we can be there. We can be at worship, but at the same time, we don't need to go so far as that we run people off or we become hypocritical in our thinking. Because if we say people can't work on a Sunday, well, how can we go and spend money and encourage that work let me put that on a regular basis. Let me put that way. Okay. Now, in verse going on, Jesus then answered him, said, "Hypocrite, does not each one of you on the Sabbath loose his ox or donkey from the stall and lead it away to water it?" So this isn't even an emergency case. And the second one, he used emergency case. Here he says, here's what you do normally. Do you not let it go so that it can be watered? He's saying you literally go and do some work. But you're going to condemn this woman. And notice, so ought not this woman, being a daughter of Abraham, who Satan has bound, think of it, for 18 years, be loosed from this bond on the Sabbath? And when he said these things, all his adversaries were put to shame, and all the multitude rejoiced with all the glorious things that were done by him. Don't you know that the multitude were great? These people have been restricting them and tying their hands and putting this great burden upon them, and he's telling them, no. This is not the way. I kind of thought about this. Sometimes we get upset if services run long because we all got our food plans. And yet, and the times they really go long is when somebody may respond and somebody might even be baptized. Throw a baptism or two in there and it really gets long, right? It's kind of like that's what they're doing. They're complaining about somebody being healed. It's almost like they're complaining about a baptism. So they're complaining about something they ought to be rejoicing about.
It's obvious to look at it from our many years separated. They were very much hating Jesus.
Well, that's true. They very much.
They were looking for any excuses to condemn him or to minimize him or to do those things because he was stirring the pot.
He was, but I think we had to realize, as much as he was stirring the pot, this is part of the reason, it's kind of that point of understanding that if they had been doing things right, how much of the pot could he have stirred? I remember somebody tried to tell me one time they were just dealing the hand they'd been dealt. And a point I made to them, but you were stacking the deck. You're the one dealing it and you're stacking the deck. They were the one certain in this situation of creating this idea that people could not do anything. And people have still done that today at points. That if you do anything, you're doing wrong. And I grew up, in an area where they always, for some reason, were trying to make the Lord's Day the Sabbath day. And it would get a lot like that. And I used to laugh because my mother would have to do a full day's work before we ever left for services.
How long has it been this country, since this country abolished blue laws that prohibited everything from being open?
And probably the last, some of it started back during World War II because factories started being open then. Businesses started following suit not long after that. Some were, but they grew in popularity. And some of them, as Ron called the blue laws, some places had laws that restricted even able to be open. And that's what I was about to say, that even in the 70s and 80s, they were there. So, and it was based on this. And the reality of it is, some of it, not to give it a plug, but Chick-fil-A, they still close on a Sunday. Yeah, and Chick-fil-A will revoke your franchise if you try to open on a Sunday. They'll take it away from you. So it is. It's a change in culture.
When I grew up as a young child, you didn't go fishing on
He didn't go.
There's things you just didn't do on Sunday, you know. But in the denomination I was in, it was referred to as a Sabbath day. You know,
Right.
nobody understood. They understood. They didn't try to understand that it was two separate. The first day of the week and Saturday were two separate things. They just their belief was that the Sabbath and the Jewish time rolled over to Sunday.
Yeah. Yeah.
So therefore, all the law applied.
Yeah, and that was the idea, and it was, as Don put it, the domination is in, and so you didn't do those things. And in fact, if you go, now I can't say this, I'll put it this way: 40 years ago in Utah, they still treated it the same way. They called it the Lord's Day, and they said that day is to be for the Lord, and most businesses were closed. It were. Right. Yeah. Yeah, that was the funny part. You couldn't, you weren't supposed to, like, we couldn't get your car fixed on Sunday, but you could go hunting on Sunday. You could go gather wood up in mountains. But there were those things that they did, and it's kind of interesting. It had a good point and a bad point. I think Ron hit the nail on the head. What we do on the Lord's Day, we need to make sure that our conscience is right. I think that's where we need to be. Now, going on with the parable. So he told a parable to those who were invited when he noted how they chose the best places, saying to them. So first of all, he heals this man and he questions him whether it's right or wrong. Now he talks about the way they treat each other or treat themselves. And so it says when he noted how they chose the best place, saying to them, when you are invited by anyone to a wedding feast, do not sit down in the best place, lest one more honorable than you be invited by him. And he who invited you and come and say to you, give place to this man. And then you begin with the shame to take the lowest place. What's his point? He said, if they've got somebody else they've invited intended for that good seat you picked, what are we going to do? They're going to move you, and now you got to get up. So he says, but when you're invited, go and sit down in the lowest place so that when he who invited you comes, he may say to you, friend, go up higher. But I repeated that. Then you will have glory in the presence of those who sit at the table with you, for whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. So there's a point there of how do you think where you rate? I never thought about that until just now. My father used to tell us, we go visit somebody, wait for them to tell you to where to be seated. That probably came from this. Never thought about it. We were taught it was being polite. There's a thing there about the point, what kind of people are we to be? That's really what he's pointing out. Those people that were sitting in those higher places on their own and rating themselves as higher, they thought of themselves highly. I want to go back to James chapter 2. My brethren, do not hold the faith of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory, with partiality. For if there should come into your assembly a man with gold rings and fine apparel, and there should also come in a poor man in filthy clothes, and you pay attention to the one wearing the fine clothes and say to him, you sit here in a good place, and say to the poor man, you stand here or sit here at my footstool, have you not shown partiality among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? You know what I like about the church? Sit wherever you want. It's a pew. Most churches. It's kind of, most people, if they have a place they regularly sit in, but if a visitor got there before them and sit there, what would most people do in this church? Sit somewhere else. You ever had somebody tell you, this is my pew? I remember preaching school. I went to Newport Richie, and this woman, and she must probably dead by now, I would assume. And I'm sitting over here somewhere, and she comes in, and she sit there. That's my spot. Excuse me? That's my spot. You're in my pew. Okay. I'm sorry. You need to get up, move. Just like that. Yes, ma'am. Give me a second. I'm sorry. And she goes, what are you looking for? I said, I was just looking for the reserved sign. That was a little wrong, but it was kind of hit me the wrong. So I got up and I moved. And then a few minutes later, they had some singing. They had some kids' songs for the kids, and they dismissed the kids to go to class. And the elder introduced me as the teacher that morning, the speaker. And they had red cushions this color, red carpet that color too. And her face matched them when I got up there to teach. And then we went to and I had my kids with me, and we went to the elder's house that afternoon, same elder. And we were talking about it, and he goes, I know exactly who you're talking about. And we tried to tell her, what if you do that to somebody who's visiting, who's not a member of the church? What are they going to think? And that's what we don't think about. That's what we do. There was a man where I grew up that walked everywhere. He walked in the parts store one day when I was working there, and he asked for a couple of parts. And I'm thinking, why do you need parts for a tractor? I have never seen you even drive a truck. And so I get the parts farm and everything, get them, and this guy comes pulling up and picks them up in a truck. And I said something to my boss, and he says, do you know who that is? I said, yeah, his name's Spate. And he goes, yeah, do you know he owns about half the county? Looking at him, you'd never know it. Maybe we need to think about that a little bit. He says, have you not shown partiality among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? Listen, my beloved brethren, has God not chosen the poor of this world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom which he promised to those who love him? But you have dishonored the poor man. Do not the rich oppress you and drag you into courts? Do they not blaspheme that noble name by which you are called? I want you to think about something. Who was Jesus? Not the Son of God. I want to talk about the man. Who was Jesus? A carpenter's son and a carpenter. How were they on the totem pole in Israel? Very, very low. In fact, let's just get it straight. Not just a carpenter's son, a poor carpenter's son. Galileans, what was offered for the sacrifice when he was brought to the temple? 2 doves. That was the stipulation for those who were poor and could not afford to give a lamb. No, he had no esteem, and we wouldn't esteem him. But at this point of being poor, do they not blaspheme that noble name by which you're called? They really do. If you really fulfill the royal law according to the scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. You do well. But if you show partiality, you commit sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. What's God expect of us? Treat everybody the same. Treat them the same. In chapter 4 and verse 8 through 12, draw near to God and he'll draw near to you. Clear your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Lament, mourn, and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves inside the Lord and he will lift you up. Isn't that what he's trying to get us to do? Realize the need to humble ourselves. Wouldn't it be better to let God exalt us than to have him humble us? You think about a lot of those people that tried to exalt themselves, questioning Jesus on things that they knew him to be right. but trying to show him up, and yet would end up humbled, like that ruler of the synagogue, speaking out and saying, do not speak evil of one another, brethren. He who speaks evil of a brother and judges his brother speaks evil of the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge. There is one lawgiver who is able to save and destroy. Who are you to judge another? So, this without partiality and keeping that in mind. And he points out and he goes to the one that had the supper. Then he also said to him, invited him, when you give a dinner or a supper, do not ask your friends, your brothers, your relatives, nor rich neighbors, lest they also invite you back and you be repaid. Which when you give a feast, invite the poor, the maimed, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you shall be repaid at the resurrection of the just. Did Jesus say he could never have friends over anything? No, he's just saying, invite those people that can't. Don't just invite people that will return your hospitality, but be hospitable to the point that even those people who can't repay your hospitality can. It's kind of like Martha and Don. I want to throw them out there. Who'd they leave out last night? They didn't leave anybody out of it. The only people that missed out on Martha and Don's invitation were the ones that chose not to come. They opened up their home to everybody. There was no partiality in it. Now, I'm sure at times they invite people over. In fact, probably Thanksgiving, it's going to be limited to who is there. It's going to be limited at my house. We all tend to do that. But there's times we open up our hearts and we do things for whoever we can, whenever we can. And we're looked to help. And we don't look to do it for glory. They didn't do it for glory. They did it to provide something for the church. And it was a good time. These people, that's their problem. They're looking at, the whole point of this, they're looking to exalt themselves. So real quick, we're going to go through the last part of this, because it's real important, and how exalting ourselves and thinking too highly of ourselves can get us into trouble. Notice, now when one of those who sat at the table with him heard these things, he said to him, blessed is he who shall eat bread in the kingdom of God. Now one of the things of that time was the expectation of this great feast when the Messiah came. And that's what he's talking about. Well, blessed is he. So then Jesus said to him, a certain man gave a great supper, invited many, and sent his servant at the supper time to say to those who were invited, come, for these all things are now ready. But they all with one accord began to make excuses. The first said to him, I have bought a piece of ground, and I must go and see it, and I ask you to have me excused. Now, I want you, as we read the excuses, think about how wrong they sound. Like a man buying a piece of ground that he's never seen. Okay, then another, I bought 5 yoke of oxen, I'm going to test them. I asked you to have me excused. Still another, I have married a wife, therefore I cannot come. He's probably the most honest one. So, got to get permission. So that servant came and reported these things to his master. Then the master of the house being angry, said to his servant, go out quickly into the streets and the lanes of the city and bring in here the poor and the maimed and the lame and the blind. Do you understand what Jesus is talking about? He brought up, blessed he who eats bread in the kingdom of God. And he's pointing. Yeah, and he's telling them, you guys think you're going to be there, and with this attitude, you're turning it down. Now, and the servant said, Master, it is done as you commanded, still there is room. And then the master said to the servant, go out into the highways and hedges and compel them to come in, that my house may be filled. For I say to you that none of those men who are invited shall taste my supper. I keep reading. We shall all stand in judgment. And I keep thinking, those that try to stand at judgment are probably going to be the ones that are lost. I think the true faithful won't try to stand. They'll kneel. They'll bow down before the Lord in humility. When it says He'll wipe away every tear, reach conclusion. Some of those tears will be from the Lord, and there'll be two types of tears from those who are saved. They'll be shedding tears for those who are lost. And yet they'll also be shedding tears for the joy of being there. Now that's my conclusion. I think context is really referring to the sorrow. At judgment, there's going to be a lot of sorrow. But wouldn't it be better to cast yourself down before the Lord in humility, realizing that the blood His Son gave for us, that we were never worthy of it. And even on that day, we're still an unprofitable servant, and have Him lift us up and say, enter in, good and faithful, and live this life and with that attitude that I deserve nothing. And it's only His good grace, and I strive to be right with Him and be able to enter in. Let Him lift us up. Then to think, yep, I'm doing it all. I'm doing everything You want me to do, Lord. Kind of like that Pharisee praying at the wall. You're lucky I'm on your side. And to face Him in humiliation on the day of judgment. I think that's what we need to learn from this modern time. That time they need to learn that themselves, they were facing humiliation and didn't even know it. And He was trying to explain it to them. Just because of their lack of love and compassion. In reality, without compassion, it's not love, no matter what we say. If there's any we can help this evening, we'd ask you to come as we stand and as we sing.
I am mine no more. I am mine no more. I've been bought with blood. I am mine no more. Jesus is my Lord. Jesus is my Lord, and He rules my life. Jesus is my Lord. He will come again. He will come again, and He'll take me home. He will come again. I am mine no more. I am mine. mine no more. I've been bought with blood. I am mine no more.
Thank everyone for being here this evening. Are there any who need to partake of the Lord's Supper? All right. We'll have that after closing prayer. Also, next Sunday night, I will be giving